Are you ready, Martin? Okay, people, I think we'll make a start. If we could call the room to order, please. Mrs. Spears? Kathy? Thank you. I'll just wait for these members of the public to enter the room. Welcome to this first council meeting of 2021. I will just start with the council blessing before I say any more. And Martin Halliday, Councillor Halliday, is going to read that for us today.
As we deliberate on the issues before us, we trust that we will reflect positively on the communities we serve. Let us all seek to be effective and just, so that with courage, vision and energy, we provide positive leadership in a spirit of harmony and compassion.
Thank you, Councillor Halliday. Today I'm going to be chairing the meeting. My name's Janet Holber, I'm the Deputy Mayor. Guru is absent today. He's attending a mayoral forum on the Three Waters, which is an extremely important challenge that we face this year in 2021. And it's important that across the councils in the region and across the country, we have an integrated approach to how we're going to deal with that issue. So very important business he's attending today, and he sends his apologies, but we'll deal with that in apologies. We also have Councillor Coots, who's Zooming in today due to being unable to attend in person due to an injury. And we carry on with item 3, which is apologies. So I've already recorded the apology of His Worship the Mayor. We also have apology from Jackie Elliott, whose mother's unwell, and Holly Ewins, Chair of the Paikakarika Community Board. Are there any further apologies? Yes. James Westbury is an apology today, but we do have representation from the Waikanae Community Board here today. So I will look for a mover for those apologies. Moved by Councillor Compton, seconded by Councillor Pravanov. All in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? That's carried. Item 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. Do I have any declarations of interest? So we move on to public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. We have a few public speakers today. And first up we have Rachel Barwell, the Kapiti Climate Change Action Group. Welcome, Rachel. Come up to the podium. We've changed the microphone system, so the microphone is on all the time. Everybody will be pleased to hear. I just have to make sure that I remember to turn mine off for any councillors to speak. So if I forget to do that, please do let me know. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm representing the Kapiti Climate Change Action Group this morning. We as a group have, and we're speaking to the Sustainable Transport Strategy that is on the agenda for adoption today. So we as a group have reviewed the proposed strategy and strongly recommend the Council does not adopt it in its present form. If the version that was presented on the electronic agenda is the final version, we're very concerned because it still appears in tracked changes with many additions. If it is that final version, certainly I wouldn't be recommending you adopt it, and if it is not, then that needs to be clarified. What is the final version? And the reasons we feel whatever version is going to be adopted is insufficient is that it really does not meet the current and future needs of our community for the following reasons. It does not have climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience or restoration at the heart of its purpose, or implementation, and given our climate emergency, it needs to have that. It flies in the face of central government's zero carbon bill of 2019, the Climate Emergency Declaration of 2020 that was supported by our Prime Minister, and other climate change initiatives for government to rapidly become carbon zero. And it makes a mockery of your own council's Climate Emergency Declaration from May 2019. As transport contributes 57% of Kapiti's greenhouse gas emissions, it is one critical and obvious. You could almost call it a low-hanging fruit area where council can have a direct and powerful impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and provide leadership within the community to come on board and shift their personal transport behaviours towards a low emissions future. The Climate Change Commission's carbon budget is due to be released to central government this coming Monday, and it would be prudent to defer adoption of this strategy until those recommendations can be fully considered by council and integrated into a revised and strengthened strategy that reflects the true climate and humanitarian emergency that we're facing as a community, a nation, and ultimately as a global community. In the strongest words possible, I recommend council not adopt the current sustainable transport policy that's on the table today and direct your officials to go back to the drawing board in light of the aforementioned declarations, policies and the forthcoming carbon budget. And I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Alison Lash.
Thank you, Rachel.
Kia ora koutou. Good morning, councillors. Thank you. My comments basically just support what Rachel said in the strongest way. The climate change report will be due out on Monday, as you know. It's certain to include emissions reductions for fossil fuel cars, and local councils are bound to be expected to support the central government's efforts to achieve the targets that will be set or proposed in the report. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense to be adopting a strategy today when on Monday you have a whole new set of parameters to consider. And secondly, your climate change emergency declaration, you've got to do more than pay lip service to this. As Rachel said, 57% of the district's emissions come from transport. And it's one of the few areas where you as a council can actually pull some active levers, and you should do so. And this proposed strategy that we saw in the marked up version doesn't do that. It's very light on detail. It pays some lip service to climate change, but it's an also-ran. It turns up alongside things like improved connectivity, amenity, resilience, and affordability. And these are important considerations, no question. But the connections between those things and climate change are not made in this document. And you haven't declared an emergency for connectivity or affordability. And the good reason for that is because there are important considerations, but they are not something that threaten our way of life or our continued existence, in fact. But climate change does, and that's what your climate emergency declaration recognised. But the strategy doesn't, or at least the draft that I saw doesn't. So declaring a climate emergency is not enough. You must do more. You must act on it. And I think it means delaying adoption of this strategy until you can consider the Climate Change Commission's report and redraft the strategy to reflect the findings of that report and integrate fighting climate change into the strategy, because it isn't integrated currently. It's just sitting there as something and also ran alongside. So I urge you not to adopt this report, not to agree to the officer's recommendations, and to send the strategy back to be reworked. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Do you have any questions for Rachel or Alison from elected members? Yes, Councillor McCann.
It's probably a question you can't ask because it's hypothetical. What type of changes or points within the Climate Change Commission report could you expect would impact on the strategy that we are attempting or suggested that we should pass today?
Well, I'm assuming that because transport is such a huge contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions of the whole country and this district, that there will be targets proposed for reducing those significantly if we're to reach, contain the global warming within 1.5 and to meet the country's commitments to the Paris Climate Accord. there must be some reduction, in significant reduction in fossil fuel emissions.
So if that were one of the Climate Change Commission report's recommendations, how would that flow on into the strategy that we have in front of us?
Well, I think that's what needs to be thought about carefully. I mean, I can't offer you a solution for that today. There are some fairly obvious levers, I would think. I understand that the Regional Council is planning to fully electrify all of its public transport fleet, propose that in its long-term plan. That's my understanding. And that would be great, and you could support that. But you can go beyond that as well. I mean, there are things that you can do. The CWB network in this district is great. It could be extended significantly. You could, I'm hoping that's what's happening when the Old State Highway gets revoked is some physical separation of cycleways and normal traffic carriageway, but none of this stuff is around yet, and it seems to me to be premature to be adopting a sustainable transport strategy when you don't know these things yet. Well, I mean, you may know about that particular thing, but there are so many levers that local government can pull on this directly. Lots of the other levers on climate change are in central government's hands. They're not in your hands. But this is one where you do have some direct levers you can pull, and you can exercise a significant leadership role on this. But that's not in the strategy.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have a question before Councillor Compton, you can ask after me. So did you have the opportunity as a group to comment on the draft strategy or to submit on that? And
yes, we did.
So, have your comments been taken into consideration, do you feel?
Not obviously. I mean, the problem is that the electronic agenda that we downloaded off the net was a draft version, a markup version. It's not the final, presumably. And so I don't know what you people have seen, but that's the version that I've seen. And so it's not a bit hard to know what we're commenting on. But the draft, if it was a reasonably final draft, it doesn't appear to take into account much of what was submitted by our group or LCK, Low Carbon Kapiti.
Yes, I think I'll answer that right now about the different changes, because I did inquire about that yesterday. We were presented with the marked up version so that we could see the changes that have been made as opposed to the draft and what have been changed as a result of the submissions. So you haven't seen any marked up changes that have been made as a result of the submission that you made?
Very few. I mean, there might. I didn't read every single deletion to figure out what had been deleted and what had been changed. It was really difficult to read through that document because of all the markups, and I'm sure you found that too. But from what I could see, there was no significant integration as a driving force in the sustainable transport strategy of the submissions that we had made.
Thank you. Councillor Compton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your speaking to us today. I was wondering if you had changes in mind for this that you'd be able to send through, or is that something you'd look to do if we deferred adopting it today?
I think it needs a rewrite. And, I mean, I could, but I'm going on holiday next week, so,
No, fair enough.
It's not my job anymore.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to Rachel and Alison for coming in today.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Trevor Daniels. Always great to hear from you, Trevor. And while Trevor Daniels comes up, I'd like to acknowledge sitting beside Trevor today is David Ogden, who's the new chair of our Older Persons Council. Welcome and thank you for taking that on board. I think a round of applause, maybe.
Yeah, I'd like to say Happy New Year, but I'll say Happier New Year. I have the same complaint about this document. I'm talking about the sustainable transport. Very difficult to read, especially when there's obviously plenty of space to use it in a bigger font than what was available. So I'm not quite sure exactly what's in there and what's not in there, but I didn't see anywhere any mention of footpaths. I mean, that's managed transport, surely. But my main comment today is about 4.6 and 4.5, which is talking about ambulance services. It says, for instance, that anybody going from Otaki to Palmerston North has to go by private transport. Not true. St John Ambulance provide a service on 24-hour notice. It talks about the system we have for emergencies and the ambulance taking you to a local doctor up till 10 o'clock at night, but it doesn't talk about the private transport that's run by a safer Kapiti or by Kapiti carers. Ask in particular is doing the bulk of the work now. The Kapiti carers are having difficulty in getting drivers, and so they refer people who want to go into hospital to a safer Kapiti. They had a grant, and they have now a special vehicle that has hydraulic steps on the side as well as a space, and it's a big high vehicle and a hydraulic lift in the back, and they can take the biggest wheelchair as well as 9 people into town. Operation has been funded by the EMS, by the residual funds from the emergency medical service that Chris Lane used to run, for those who, and they're running out of money. So that service is going to finish at the end of June. And I think that that's a service that needs to be either supported by the council or that should be vigorously requesting the Kapiti Coast DHB to fund it. Now, we suffer from postcode health out here. That's my statement. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you the same question, Trevor. Thank you very much for, as I asked Alison, did you have an opportunity to submit into the draft transport strategy? And if so, do you feel like your comments have been taken on board?
I didn't know. I didn't didn't look for it. Sorry, no.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Yeah, I want to follow up on your concern about the font size of the report. Now, as you know, and have told us, 30% of the people in Kapiti are age 60 plus. So, do you think, and as a former Grey Power leader, do you think that more should be done to increase the font size so it could be read by most of the community?
Oh, yeah, this is nonsense. I couldn't, I had to use a magnifying glass to read what I wanted to read. Documents, you should have a minimum size font for documents that the public get to read.
Any further questions? Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
Next we have John Vickerman, who's speaking to the Waikanae water treatment plant. So this is he's speaking to a public excluded item. He's aware of the subject material of the public excluded item, hence his comments today. So because it's public excluded, though, I won't be inviting any questions. Thanks.
Yep. Deputy Mayor, councillors, community board members, I note item 12 on the agenda with apprehension. What confidence can ratepayers have in the blanket reasons given for public exclusion are genuine? I have over 50 years engineering experience. Some of my earliest work was in water treatment, and some of my work over subsequent decades has included water treatment, including consulting work for large companies such as Fonterra, and also working with equipment suppliers and manufacturers to find a solution to a particular problem. It's also included evaluation of tenders for large projects. There are typically two aspects to any project. You've got the technology, that's process capacity, process steps involved and how to work them, and the cost. The cost of precisely what is offered for a particular price is a good reason for confidentiality prior to a tender being awarded, so long as it is based on a tender document multiple suppliers have had equal opportunity to tender for. It needs to be subsequently publicly seen that when the tender is awarded, it is viewed by all as an arm's length transaction. In this case, is the commercial position or the person to be protected in fact being given a de facto monopoly for process steps or knowledge rather than on the offer of price for openly known process steps or requirements, along with some touted performance guarantee? One of our oldest areas of law go back to the English Statute of Monopolies of 1624, where all monopolies were declared void, with one exception, where someone had technical knowledge that was not publicly known, a patent monopoly on the practical working of the invention was able to be given for a limited period, providing they disclosed what it was and the best known way of working it before commercial use. At the end of the monopoly, the technical knowledge then became part of the public domain, and that still applies today. In the last decade, we've seen councils get into difficulties with large water infrastructure projects, causing immense ratepayer dissent. Part of the reason for this has been...
I think that's time up, actually. So,
okay, right.
If you'll wrap up, please. Thank you.
Right.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Could you cite your point of order, please?
The point of order is I wish to have it recorded that I object that no questions can be asked of speakers who want to speak on items of public exclusion. I just want to have my objection to that recorded. I think they should be allowed to. We should be allowed to ask questions.
I'm going to exercise my discretion as chair and not allow questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'd just like, in voting for the public excluded resolution, just ask yourselves, is the matter really likely unreasonably to prejudice the commercial position of the person who supplied the information?
Thank you. Thank you. Certainly it's been a topic for discussion in all the years I've been a councillor, this, what should be in public excluded and what shouldn't, and when should the information be released, and it's something that we've been talking about amongst ourselves as councillors as well. So we'll probably have a discussion around that when we enter public excluded later today. Thank you very much for your time today, Mr. Vickerman. So I think that brings us to the end of public speaking time today. Nobody else wants to speak today. So we move on to item 6, which is members' business. Public speaking time responses. For the last item, I think because it's public excluded, I won't be inviting a response either. It's unusual to be speaking about public excluded items, but I think I provided a response from a councillor's point of view in terms of us exercising our discretion as to whether to enter public excluded or not. So in terms of the sustainable transport strategy, if it's all right with the presenters, I will be inviting responses to that when we reach that part of the agenda. It shouldn't take too long to get there. And with that, we'll move on to 6B, leave of absence. Do I have any requests for leaves of absence? There being none, I'll move on. I haven't heard of any matters of an urgent nature. So 7, Mayor's report. I don't think I have one tabled today, and it being the first meeting of the year, I don't suppose there would be a lot of substance in such a report anyway. So we're on to the meaty part of the meeting now, which is our reports. So our first report is amendments to the council delegations to chief executive and staff. Welcome. Thank you, Sarah. And Janice? We have Sarah Lloyd and Janice McDougall presenting this report. Thank you. So, do you have the presentation to go with the report?
Not today.
Not today.
Kia ora koutou, katoa. My name's Sarah Lloyd. For those of you that don't know me, I think this is the first report I've presented to this council, so kia ora. I'm here just presenting my delegations to the council delegations to the Chief Executive and staff. So I'd just like to take the report as read and field any questions through you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a process report, so it's quite usual to take it as read. Do we have any questions? Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, in terms of the delegations that we've got under the new legislation that Parliament passed last year around special purpose vehicles and that with us being a responsible levy authority, do those delegations to the CE include the ability to set those levy rates where they might be used for SPV infrastructure, or is that a decision that would ultimately come back to council, or does that have to be kept at arm's length from council under those, from the governing body, I should say, under those pieces of legislation?
I'm pretty sure that it's outside our remit, but I'll just get our legal advisor Ian Thorpe to answer that question.
Approach the microphone, please, Mr. Thorpe.
We need a microphone on it. No, still not going in.
Still not going?
Going now? Okay.
Can I use my public speaking voice?
Now, if you turn it back on, it should work.
It's preferable that we have the microphone working for the purposes of the live streaming.
Is it working? Am I working now? Red seems like a colour indicating caution to me, so apologies. I'm Ian Thorpe, I'm legal counsel here. I was reviewing the Act before I came in. It seems to me that the power to make a levy order under the Act actually sits with central government ultimately in response to recommendations. It's made by way of an order in council. I can check that in more detail if you need me to, but it doesn't seem to me that the Chief Executive gets the power to set the levy amount.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Councillor Randall.
Yeah, Madam Chair, my question, is addressed to Mr. Mellon, actually. It's it's under his team. Now, it's a replacement title for Team Leader, Roading, Asset Management and Safety. Why leave out the word safety when my understanding is you've reorganised to have a staff member concentrating on road safety? I just wondered, is there any reason why you've left out the title or the word safety in the new position?
Through you, Madam Chair, really that's a reflection of that role actually taking on other aspects of the asset management area within the transport team, so not just solely focused on safety. So that's safety plus the asset management and delivery work that goes on within that space. That's primarily the reason for the change.
Any further questions? So I'll invite somebody to move recommendations 23 and 24 on page 9 of elected members' papers. Moved by Councillor Buswell, seconded by Councillor Randall. Any comments? I'll put that motion. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried.
Thank you.
We move on now to the Sustainable Transport Strategy. Welcome, Suzanne Rushmere.
Kia ora everyone, Suzanne Rushmere from the Access and Transport team. Council's happy. I'd just like to take the report as read, but there are some things that I would like to draw your attention to. So the strategy is a review of the original strategy that was produced in 2008, and the reason being is there's been some quite hefty changes to our roading network since then, plus some legislative changes as well that I wanted to reflect. So a briefing was first presented to Council in January of last year, followed by workshops, some attendance at various focus groups, so the CWB group, Older Persons Council, Road Safety Advisory Group, etc. And consultation or public consultation followed in June, July of last year. So the strategy presented today is an updated version of the draft that was approved by Council in May 2020 for consultation. And following the consultation, I reported back to Council with a report on what was received from the submissions that we had. The consultation responses informed the development of the strategy, and I think this was raised earlier. The reason that the track changed version was presented was because I wanted to show what changes have been made as a result of the consultation, and the idea is that the final printed version would look very much like the draft one that was produced last year. So we've worked in partnership with our iwi, and this led to the development of a memorandum from the Aotearoa Whakarongotai Trust, which has informed the development. The other two iwi, we have done briefings with them through Te Whakamininga, and also the Hapu Otaki have expressed a desire to review the final strategy, which is why there's a second recommendation in the report to sort of look at addressing that. There's been a couple of minor errors that have been identified post the draft, or post the Council receiving the report that's in front of them today, which are extremely minor and hopefully can be dealt with through minor changes, one additional word that shouldn't be there, and one sentence that just didn't make sense. So that's been addressed, and we can make sure that that's reflected in the final printed version.
Thank you. In terms of responding to public speakers, Sean, would you
If I could just add, Madam Chair, yeah, there were... So I'm on. We'll go. So yeah, there were several issues raised through the public speaking. I guess in hindsight, maybe it would have been useful to have a track changes version and an edited version that showed those changes adopted. That might have made it easier for some people to read the final document. Although you can track through, it might be a bit difficult in terms of the way that it's laid out, but that's generally how we do document reviews with the track changes version. So certainly possibly for next time. There was also a comment around the font size, and we do have a standard font size that we use for all of our documentation, and as far as I'm aware, this document has been delivered through our standard process. The PDF, the way it's been created to a PDF may have had something to do, I think, maybe with the way the font has turned out in terms of the scale. So maybe that's something for us to be aware of in the future if we're providing electronic PDF documents with font that people want to print off to review. That I'm not sure if you can actually manually change the size of the font within the PDF document itself anyway, but so yeah, we do have standard size fonts for all of our documentation. There were some, obviously the climate aspects that were raised. There were a number of comments there raised. The document itself, the strategy, and maybe if you have a look at the executive summary and the addressing challenges section through the document, it isn't a climate action plan in terms of the transport activity across the district. I think there was reference to it includes connectivity and accessibility and a whole lot of other aspects to the transport network that do need to be considered as part of your strategy. That then allows you I guess, gives you a framework to deliver those action plans that sit underneath the strategy that talk about how you might adapt or mitigate those climate change issues associated with transport. So certainly the intention is to come back to you, and I think we have a briefing on the 18th to talk about that climate action plan, and sitting underneath that framework strategic document will be a whole lot of action plans that look to leverage off whatever the government provides in terms of the information that's coming about expectations around adaptation and mitigation. So it also isn't, I guess, an activity management plan, and again, you will see coming through council activity management plans for the transport area, and in that plan we'll have more detail around action and delivery of adaptation and mitigation within the transport sector itself, both within how we manage the provision of the network for transport for the district and infrastructure that we build and manage associated with that, and also the link from there to obviously the district plan and provisions associated with transport, because again, in terms of adaptation and how you might implement mode shift and getting people to use less of their own private vehicles and get them onto public transport, this links there into how we develop subdivisions and how you make them more accessible for public transport. How do you incentivise again, there's mention there of the CWB and links between the CWB, transport hubs, the provision of those facilities on the transport network itself, which again would all be, you'd expect to see within your activity management plans, your action plan associated with transport in terms of mitigation adaptation. So obviously an option is to leave the report on the table if you want to wait until the government provides that guidance, but I would say this document gives you the opportunity to take that information and insert it into our delivery plans and have this framework sitting over the top of it as a strategy that highlights the importance of those different aspects of the entire transport network. So not just climate, there are other aspects of this that incorporate a whole lot of different feedback from the community into the transport area. And I'm not sure whether Susan can answer the comment. There was a comment made about that we haven't, it's not obvious where we've included or taken on board comments from the engagement that we have entered into with those groups, and I thought we certainly had taken that on board and incorporated them into the document. Maybe Susan might be able to reference that.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think what I was trying to achieve with this was a document that has some longevity. This is always going to be done in a point of time, and things continually change, which is why I tried to sort of put principles that we can hook things onto from which the action plans fall out. And one of the examples is that one of the things in the climate change focus areas that we give effect to anything that's coming out from central government policy. I had a quick look at some of the submissions, and certainly for the climate change or low carbon Kapiti submission, there was some useful data in there which I included as part of the challenges, and I updated the climate change focus area to reflect that. There were some things in there that we don't have control over, and so it was difficult to include it in our strategy. And there were some things that other organisations are doing. So one of the suggestions was integrated ticketing. That's been dealt with through Greater Wellington Regional Council through the Regional Land Transport Plan. I've tried to make sure that all of the submissions that I received went into the development of this final document, and that's part of the reason that I presented the report to Council in October last year that said this is what the outcome of the consultation says. And I used that as a basis to sort of move this document forward through developing that. So, and I think as Sean said, there's an action plan element and a strategy element, and what I was trying to do with the strategy element was keep that high level and something that had some longevity, so that we weren't having to go back and review it every time there was changes to central or regional policy.
Thank you. So that concludes the presentation and the responses to public speaking time from staff today. Certainly there's been a huge amount of work that's gone into this, and while the track changes version might have been a little difficult to read maybe and navigate through, it certainly reflected the response and the massive amount of work that goes into this kind of document to get from draft stage to final stage, and I certainly had a new and profound appreciation of that through reading through this document. So I have a couple of questions already. Councillor Compton and Councillor Hanford after that. Thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, I note on page 27.11, it's got the risk of not adopting the strategy now is low, but consistency with the strategic business case and the activity management plan will have support. So it's all about funding that we get from, I presume, Roka Kotahi, NZTA. Given that, I guess, if we left this on the table today, it's not going to be able to be considered again until the 25th of February. Is there any financial risk in terms of that funding from that we get the 50% funding we get, or is that all sort of locked in and there's sort of, I guess, a negligible risk of that being impacted?
I don't believe there's any specific risk in that sort of time frame. The issue is, I guess, that we are progressing with, so the activity management plan in its draft form is with audit as part of the ELTP process. So aspects of that are linked to the strategy, obviously. So, and our initial input into the regional land transport program has obviously some aspects to the strategy that link into that document that is going through a review and process at the moment. So, so no, I don't believe there's any specific risk to funding. I guess the risk is if there were to be changes, they may not necessarily have time to reflect those back in those other documents that are actually sort of in train at the moment. The other aspect, I guess, to that is in terms of what might come from the government. Again, staff are comfortable that the document gives enough scope for us to be able to accommodate those changes in the relevant areas of focus in terms of action, that we don't believe that would necessarily mean that would need to be a change to the strategy itself as it sits at the moment, regardless of what comes out through that process. But yeah, in saying that, I don't know what's likely to come, but those are the issues.
Thank you. And just following up on that, because obviously, as was mentioned, the Climate Change Commission has their budgets coming out on Monday, but my understanding is that those budgets are advice to the government, and then the government of the day makes decisions about how the country's going to meet those. So there's obviously a response time that the government's got to go back to the Climate Change Commission and say this is how we intend to meet the budgets for this year in the various sectors. So presumably that would, I guess, because I'm just weighing up the options here, that would potentially run out beyond the 25th of February as well. Question mark.
Yeah, I expect there would need to be some time for what that might mean and what that might look like then to be taken through some sort of process. So yeah, you may not have enough information by the next meeting to actually know what you might need to think about in terms of any sort of change anyway. And if there is certainly time again, I guess, to look to amend something in the future if there was a need or felt there was a need to do that, and to come back through council to do that in 12 months' time or 6 months' time, or for that aspect of the document if there was something that needed to change. But again, we've also got more work to come in terms of climate, in terms of action plans, in terms of mechanisms for delivery and change, that are further mechanisms where you might be able to look at how do you influence change in behaviour and adaptation and mitigation and transport.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Compton. Councillor Hanford.
Kia ora. Thank you, Suzanne, for all of the work on this. Really appreciate the mahi. I've got a few questions. The first one's relatively minor, but outcome 6 on page 66 is titled climate change, and I don't think climate change is an outcome that we want. So could that potentially be something along the lines of addressing the climate emergency? Because the other outcomes are framed positively. So if that's, just a minor one, but also quite important because it could be interpreted wrong. And I'd just like to also total call the sentiment of both Rachel and Alison's speeches and public speaking, the fact that we need to be taking this really seriously. So I have a question around, the potential for deferring adoption and the ability we would have to actually be able to make changes in the next couple of months. Like, what's the capacity like of staff to be able to do that? What's the potential for ensuring that potentially we revisit some of those submissions that were made to make sure that they have been adequately represented in the strategy, and also then we're able to bring back a draft or one that's ready for adoption with a font size that's easier for people to review, and all of those things. So just wondering what the capacity is for that to happen, and are there any things that would mean that would be difficult to achieve? Yeah.
I'm happy to respond to some of those, if that's okay. So from a point of view of the positive framing of the outcome, absolutely. I mean, all the rest are framed positively, and I think that was probably just an error on my part that I hadn't quite cottoned onto the fact that wasn't either. So absolutely happy to amend that to addressing climate change. It's tricky, like I said. I tried to do a document that has some longevity, and there's always going to be changes, and so through a strategy. If we respond to every change that comes along from central government policy through an update to the strategy, it could be, reviewing it all the time, which is why I tried to put that hook in there about our action plans will take effect of, will sort of be consistent with what's going on from a central and regional level. And there was one final question which I completely forgotten now.
Okay.
It's my ability. So I'm certainly, I'm kind of dealing with the strategy. I've got sort of switched it in gear to looking towards the transport bylaw, and that's got to be done by October. So it's tricky, but obviously Sean has a better handle on what the overall group looks like over the next few months than me.
So substantive changes and rewrites and that sort of work, certainly not in the next 4 to 6 weeks, what with everything that's going on with the LTP and activity management plans and all of that work. But one option that you might want to consider is that we're more than happy to meet with Alison and their group to see if there are things that there was some suggestion that it wasn't obvious where their comments had been adopted into the document. One option would be to leave the report on the table till the next meeting, to have a follow-up meeting and see where there are, if we can be clearer about that, talk through the intent of the strategy itself, and that it won't necessarily deliver everything that that group is looking for, but to make substantive changes and to push this out for 2 or 3 months. I guess the resourcing, we wouldn't be able to do that certainly within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Then again, if you've got stuff coming from the government, if we're talking 3 to 4 months, then we're pushing further out, and there may be a risk then in terms of the RLTP, and our ability to access funding. I don't think it's significant. It would mean, we're in a sort of funny space. We've got a draft document that's still subject to change, and yet at the same time we're approving budgets and submitting into a funding program with Waikanae that actually requires the substance sitting behind those to justify them in terms of their final approval. So it just makes things a bit difficult, and there is an element of risk associated with it.
And sorry, really quickly, just one last question. You mentioned that to review the strategy regularly obviously takes up a lot of resource. Do you think then, if we were of the mind as individual councillors that there were some things about the strategy we thought should potentially be changed, or based off of what we've heard this morning, that it would be better to let it lie on the table?
I guess that's a question for councillors. I mean, certainly from my perspective, like I said, there's this constant change, but Sean's obviously just made the suggestion that if that particular group wants me to sit down with them and go through the submission and how I've tried to address it in the strategy, I'm equally happy to to do that. But that does mean there's a delay and we'd have to come back. And so in terms of time frame, the RLTP is actually going up for public consultation mid-February, which obviously is a slightly different time frame to what we're looking at in terms of here. The papers for the next meeting needs to be out on the 10th of Feb. I'm for peer review, so that's a pretty quick turnaround. I'm on leave for next week, so it's tight. And the NLTP, I think they're going through their first round of moderation in mid-February as well. So the RLTP and the NLTP timeframes, even though there's the actual final documents are a sort of good few months out, there's some processes that are starting to happen in February, mid-February, that obviously doesn't match quite so well with the timetable.
Thank you. Did that answer your questions, Councillor Hanford? Councillor Coots online.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Can we have the volume up, please, Grayson?
Yep. Testing, testing.
Just hang on a minute, James. Try it again.
All right, team, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks, James.
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year, and sorry I can't be there this morning in person. Would much rather be, to be honest. I think it's about 3 questions, and listening to the discussion. Staff, could you remind, has the council had the draft prior to track changes in a briefing? My recollection was we did have a briefing with this document, less the track changes late last year.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And listening to the discussion, my initial thoughts was whether we did let it lie on the table. However, what I'm hearing is that that staff believe there's flexibility in the document to incorporate or show effect to the concerns raised by the group through the action plans. Could you give an example of how that would work? So I was thinking, for example, if the government comes out and says there needs to be XYZ reduction in carbon emissions, how would you satisfy that in terms of the questions raised by Alison and Rachel?
I could. So one option might be there in terms of infrastructure associated with EVs, maybe somewhere that the council want to look to invest in that space to provide opportunity for more use of those particular vehicles. So then you might have an area within your aero transport activity management plan that actually links to the provision of that infrastructure and a budget line associated with that comes through that particular process. You may then, we're talking about the, I think we're looking at the traffic bylaw, transport bylaw at the moment. So you may, within the transport bylaw itself, you might want to look at parking restrictions and incentivising, trying to use that as a lever to get more people to make use of public transport. We also, the subdivision development principles and guidelines is another document that we use as part of our subdivision planning. There's a process at the moment we're looking at in terms of updating that. You may again look through that to focus more within subdivisions in terms of limiting parking and vehicle movements through there, and focusing more on making more public transport available, increasing linkages between the other piece of work is the open space strategy that's happening at the moment. You would use, I guess, this transport strategy as a framework sitting over that to make sure that accessibility and walking distance to parks and the CWB network itself is all enhanced through that, with the transport strategy saying that our focus will be to look at how do we improve that access and how do we deal with climate. So those are a number of things that you certainly have the opportunity, and those are actually physical aspects of making change that you could have an opportunity to do. With the document as it sits at the moment, gives you plenty of scope to do that.
Am I able to, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that's going on sort of nationally as well that we would need to take account of as a council. So just in terms of the national policy statement, there's a requirement on district councils to remove all the parking standards from the district plan, and that's to support the shift in sort of moving away from private car and towards more sustainable modes. So council will have to do that. So there's other sort of areas, and then there's the advocating role that council plays in terms of working with organisations like Greater Wellington Regional Council in terms of supporting better rail and public transport services, the national integrated ticketing process, and things like that. So there's opportunities of working with partners, and I've put the hooks in the document that talks about that advocacy role and that working in partnership role to support actions that are falling out from the strategy as well.
Thank you, team. So essentially the larger overarching document puts pressure on the strategies and actions below that. So, I mean, would it be fair to say that there would be more opportunity for the low carbon Kapiti, etc., to influence our actions from that overarching document down on the actual actions and so forth? It gives probably more of a broader spectrum, in my opinion, but that's sort of what I'm hearing. It gives multiple opportunities across all of our different actions, whether it be building, whether it be roading, and so forth.
Is that a question? Well,
that's certainly the aim.
Well, I certainly don't think it limits that ability at all as it sits at the moment.
All right, I just had two more. So lastly, given that the paper refers to seeking more feedback from Ngā Hapu o Otaki, there is a delay in that itself that does tend to, I guess, raise merit around the letting it lie on the table. But am I hearing that it is too tight a turnaround to get it to the next meeting so that it isn't sitting on the table for 3 months?
Certainly from my perspective, yes, with the requirement for the peer review for the next meeting. In terms of Ngā Hapu o Otaki, I'm not anticipating any major changes resulting from that review. It's been through to Whakamininga. They've been invited to and attended the workshop. There's significant change made to the document as a result of the memorandum from Aotearoa Whakarongotai Trust. And so, but I mean, obviously that's their prerogative, but I'm not anticipating there's going to be major changes as a result of their review.
Okay, I have one more matter, which is actually just an item within the document itself, page 51. And look, because it's a PDF, I couldn't scan it to see whether it was, my apologies if it is included somewhere else, but it refers to the lack of connectivity, mode choice, and so forth within the district, naming, for example, Paikakariki, Otahanga, Otaki and Waikanae North. I'm pretty sure I'd raised it in the previous briefing last year, but Tuhoro and Tohoro Beach, is there any reason why they're not included in there?
Not at all, and I can correct that.
Thank you. That's all from me, Madam Chair.
Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, staff, for all the work that's gone into this paper, and also thank you to various groups who have actually spent the time to look at this report and to make comments on it. So I've got a couple of thoughts about this. So first of all, safety 4.6 on page 55. So this sort of ties into the statement there and then the outcomes that are later in the paper. So it talks about, I suppose, human error and speed, but it doesn't really talk about the impact of design. And I think when you look at some of the NZTA information, they talk about design being one of the key factors that influences the accident rate, and I think that needs to be incorporated in there as well somehow. And I certainly know that reducing speed is a very it's a cheap way of hopefully reducing accidents, but I think sometimes the design aspect really does need to be considered as well. The other one that I wanted to bring up has been touched before is climate change. So on page 58, it the paper talks about what targets New Zealand is aiming for in, I can't remember what it is, in a few years' time, 10 years' time, I think it is. But it doesn't really say in the paper that that this council is actually wanting to achieve those ourselves. And I think that's, I think it's really important to verbalise that this council is wanting to achieve those. And then when you actually go to the outcomes, which are later in the paper, it doesn't actually really address how we're actually going to deal with those as well. So I think, these it'll be useful to have some information in there as well. And I think also too, Mr. Mellon's talked about the way that what council itself can do, and that's really positive. But I think it also too, and I've talked about this before, is about changing the mindset of the public in terms of better transport opportunities. And I know that works with Greater Wellington in terms of how that is all set up. But I think there's actually a lot that can be done. You don't have to be overly specific, but actually you have, just giving some general viewpoints about the way that we're trying to head. And I think it'd be good to include those as well. Thank you.
Is it possible to include those extra at this point?
So the first aspect there, design. I'm not sure in what context, because so there are minimum standards in terms of design with regard to safety that are given for any work on the transport network. You've got a mandatory obligation to comply with those. So was it using design as a mechanism to reduce or improve safety? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I think Suzanne has a response to that as well.
It was just a couple of things. So in terms of the focus area, one of the outcomes I've got is ensuring that safety is fundamental to the design of new development, and then another one is opportunities to make improvements to our road network, including safe speeds, intersection design, and things like that. So we have a road safety action plan that is sort of been produced every 3 years, and that forms part of the action plan to deliver that. We have our speed limits review, and then we recently submitted to the NZTA the road safety programme, which identifies what measures we're putting in place and we're seeking funding for going forward. So the design and stuff is kind of mentioned in the focus areas, but obviously if there's an opportunity to sort of make that a bit more apparent, I can make a minor change to address that for sure.
We can include the council target for 2025 in terms of the carbon neutral, if it isn't already in there.
I think I've included a new target in here. I think there's a 40% reduction by certain dates, and so I'm sure that I put that in the focus areas, but I can make sure that's double checked and correct that omission if it's not in there. But there's a regional target, which is the 40%, and that's consistent with the national target. And I think if we sort of try to repeat all these targets, and it kind of doesn't give us that flexibility for that target to change if the local government or the central government legislation changes and that target moves. So again, I was trying to get some of that longevity in here as well.
Potentially just acknowledging that the council has previously committed to that target rather than it being a goal or an outcome.
Yeah.
And what was the last? Sorry, Councillor, the last thing.
So the two bits for safety and climate change.
Oh, yeah.
Another question I have. So, when will this document be next reviewed? Is it a 10-year time frame, or is it short, or it doesn't have any set time frame?
I think the time frame that I was looking towards was sort of 2030, 2040, but certainly we kind of have done a 12-year review this time. So my thoughts was that it was a 10-year review.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I suppose the comment in relation to the design, one of the roads that always springs to my mind when I hear about or talk about safety is Piki Pika Road. And I suppose it's a narrow road, it's a country road, it has a reasonably high speed limit, which has been reduced in places. It's got no space for cyclists. It's got very, very sharp drop-offs on the side. And to me, that is a classic example of where reducing the speed isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. It is actually a design. Obviously it's been historically built like that, but given the amount of traffic and, what will be also occurring when NZTA, the expressway opens, it will change. And so really just changing the speed is not going to really solve what potentially could happen there.
Well, it's a couple of things. So we are looking at our subdivision design principles and requirements. So that looks at what design is going forward. There's opportunities, I'm assuming, through long-term plan process and through our activity management plans to include schemes where these issues arise and have got merit. So I think that there's that's kind of the action side rather than the strategy side that will deal with what's the issue on a specific road and how might we address that issue on a specific road.
Thank you, Councillor Pravanov. Councillor McCann.
Thank you very much. Through you, Madam Chair. Did the staff think that the Climate Change Commission report that's about to come up was a consideration that councillors should consider when looking at this document?
I think central government legislation is always something that we have to consider. But again, this document was kind of started in a point in time and things continually move on. And again, that's why I tried to get that hook in there about making sure that we give effect to central government legislation through our action plans.
Cool. Thank you. I realise it's very difficult with a moving feast. And perhaps, and this is, forgive me if this is not a question, it is something that we might signal in some reports within the actual document as opposed to the document we're approving, the moving feast, because I recognise that these reports have to go through several layers of checking and approval, and by the time we're sitting down to look at them, that aspect of it can be out of date. One thing I'd like to raise through you, Madam Chair, is that in the past we've asked for the PDFs to be searchable, and there is part of this document is not searchable, which does make it difficult, and I'd just like to raise that again. Thank you.
Noted. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Randall.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the Acting Chief Executive. We heard just now that maybe they'll review this document in 12 years' time or whatever. It wasn't fixed. And I notice our outcome statements are also dated 2007. All our bylaws have to be reviewed every 10 years. Professor Palmer passed that law when he was a minister. And I can't see why perhaps council cannot look at adopting something similar, that their strategy documents, outcome documents, and other documents be reviewed every 10 years.
Noted. Thank you, Councillor Randall. Are there any further questions? So we have some recommendations in front of us today on page 29. I'd like to...
Councillor Coots was on.
Yes. Oh, Councillor Coots. I was going to invite Councillor Coots as a transport portfolio holder to signal if he'd like to move those recommendations. Apparently you can do that online now. So.
Madam Chair, I had a question prior to that, just listening to the discussion, and I'm asking whether it would be appropriate to make an amendment to recommendation 31 that refers to the minor changes post Ngā Hapu or Otaki review, and then after the word review, insert wording to the effect of including low carbon Kapiti. The difficulty that I hear in the discussion is that I think the view from Alison, I think it was Rachel, was that it requires a complete rewrite. And what I'm hearing is that that's not practical. I don't think staff believe that it's necessary. And so the middle ground is inviting them to be able to provide further feedback, as we've done with Ngā Hapu Ōtaki, noting that there is differences between the relationship and from a treaty perspective to a stakeholder. But would that be a elegant change to the situation we have around those concerns?
I think it's a very good suggestion. From the chair, I'd like to make a slightly different suggestion around that. I think the Ngā Hapu Ōtaki has a particular mana and importance that needs to be maintained in that recommendation. So I would be inclined to add a separate recommendation that the council will discuss concerns raised by it's actually the Climate Change Action Group. With them. Yeah, he's muted. Sorry, James, you've been muted for that comment, so just go back, rewind. Nope, we're still muted. Just hang on a minute. Should be good to go now.
No, we're showing unmuted at my end. I was just saying I'm not precious about the recommendations. I'm happy to second. It's probably easier at your end if someone moves what you can see there, and then I'm happy to second it, or someone else.
So Councillor Buswell has indicated she's happy to move. So do we have those recommendations to go up on the screen? And Councillor Coots will second. So what we would like to see probably is an extra recommendation that's being moved. With them needs to go at the end of that. Sorry? With them. Is that sufficient, Councillor Coots, to cover what you were, or did you want a kind of outcome to come from that discussion?
I can't actually see it, Madam Chair. So again, I'll leave it in your hands if it's read out.
I'm happy to read it out for you. That the council will discuss concerns raised by the Kapiti Climate Change Action Group with them.
That's fine by me.
Great. Okay, so those three recommendations, 30, 31 and 32, have been moved by Councillor Buswell and seconded by Councillor Coots. Right of introduction, Councillor Buswell.
I would just like to say I know that this has been a really lengthy process for our staff to go through, and it is really important, but as we progress through these processes, we understand that there are other factors involved, particularly around central government, that play a huge part in transport, particularly through our district being on the main trunk line in more ways than one. So I would like to thank the staff again for putting this together, and also today explaining how this also integrates with other strategies and policies that are going forward. And I have full confidence that this can suffice our needs for the next 10 years. So thank you.
Councillor Hanford.
I would like to put a procedural motion for this to lie on the table under 24.2D of our standing orders.
Okay, so we have a procedural motion. Can I have some advice on that? I haven't experienced one of those before.
Rosie?
Just checking on that for a minute. Okay, we're going to adjourn the meeting rather than all sit around while we discuss this, and we're due for a coffee break anyway, so we'll come back at 11 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.
D. That was with help from Gwen.
Surely their staff is instructed to do something to remove justification for why legal information. Right.